Much has already been said about British withdrawal from the European Union. Referendum results have left some in shock, as many political analysts predicted another outcome of the vote. Now, as the United Kingdom leaves the EU, British economy is out on a limb, so it is obvious that the state could use all the trade deals they can get unless new agreements and deals are made throughout Europe. Mr. Marcos Papadopoulos, political analyst and the chief editor of the Politics First magazine, will help to clarify the situation and give answers to the most intriguing questions. Hello.
Hello there, and thank you for having invited me on today.
Such an eventuality. Whether you were ready for such an eventuality.
I think that a lot of people in Britain, both members of the public and also politicians and journalists, felt that the result of the referendum was completely unpredictable. At the beginning of the year, the opinion polls were saying that the Remain camp would win. And then it was only a couple of weeks before the day of the referendum itself when the opinion polls were saying that the Leave camp would win. And of course, we know what the result was. And I think there was a lot of surprise in Britain. I think also within the British government, I think senior politicians, for example, David Cameron and George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, did believe that the Remain camp would win. But nonetheless, there was a Brexit victory. However, the question is, will Britain actually leave the European Union? Now, that is a huge question. And of course, the people in the Leave camp are hoping that the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, will invoke Article 50, and therefore Britain will begin the process of withdrawing from the European Union. But nothing's for certain. What does Brexit mean? Theresa May has already said that Brexit means Brexit, but what exactly does that involve? Does that involve Britain having access to the single European market? If it doesn't, then will Theresa May really withdraw Britain from the European Union? Because potentially speaking, if Britain doesn't have access to the single European market, that could be devastating for the British economy, for British industry, and for British jobs.
We will speak about this. So, my first question is how the Brexit will affect the relationship between the United Kingdom and Russia, and what the future of Russian and English relations do you predict?
There's no evidence, no tangible evidence, no credible evidence that the Brexit victory will have some sort of effect on relations between London and Moscow. On the one hand, Britain historically has a very antagonistic attitude towards Russia, a very suspicious attitude towards Russia. In Whitehall and Westminster, Russophobia is embedded within the British corridors of power. The bitter dislike of Russia has been prevalent there for hundreds of years. On the other hand, we have Britain sending military instructors, British military instructors to Ukraine to train the Ukrainian armed forces. And we know very well that the Ukrainian armed forces have committed appalling crimes in the east of the country, in Donetsk and Lugansk. And then we also saw at the beginning of 2014, Britain playing a leading role in the European Union in calling for sanctions to be placed on Russia. Germany, for example, was quite hesitant about placing sanctions on Russia, but Britain lobbied extremely hard, and that showed the divisions within the European Union, where Germany and France generally have good relations with Russia, but Britain historically has quite poor relations with Russia. And there's no love lost in Whitehall and Westminster for Russia. So there's no reason to suggest that the relations between Britain and Russia will improve. If anything, Britain outside of the European Union may grow closer to America, and that could simply enhance Britain's hostile approach to Russia.
So you think that new deals and talks to end Russian sanctions are not possible?
The EU doesn't show any sign of lifting its sanctions on Russia. And in regard to Britain, should obviously Britain is still a member of the European Union, but should Britain withdraw from the European Union, then it's inconceivable that Britain will not place its own sanctions on Russia. In fact, I think we can say that for certain, that Britain would place its own sanctions on Russia, which of course is damaging British trade with Russia. It's damaging British agricultural trade and British industrial trade. A very big company in Britain, JCB, which produces construction equipment, for 30, 40 years, going back to Soviet times, has been supplying goods to Russia. Well, they're no longer able to supply those goods to Russia because of the sanctions. JCB wrote a letter to Downing Street, to Prime Minister Cameron, a couple of years ago, complaining about the sanctions. They never heard any response whatsoever. So I think that in regard to Anglo-Russian relations, it's a very, very safe bet, in my opinion, that Britain outside of the EU will place its own sanctions on Russia.
Now, when Britain and the European Union are separated and the people in the United Kingdom are in uproar about the elections, how do you see the future of relations between the British people and their government?
Well, first things first, Britain hasn't left the EU. Britain is still a fully fledged member of the European Union. Theresa May has to invoke Article 50 in order for Britain to begin the process of leaving the EU, and we don't know whether that will happen. In regard to the relationship between the British government or the British political establishment, Westminster, and the British public, there's a lot of tension on behalf of the British public. If we go back to 2009, there was the expenses scandal, a huge scandal in British politics, where British politicians had been claiming expenses, claiming taxpayers' money for expenses which had nothing to do with their work. So, for example, cleaning their ponds, cleaning their swimming pools, claiming for a single paperclip, a single staple. Now, that has resulted in a great deal of bitterness towards the British public, towards Westminster. And in regard to the EU referendum, well, I think people in both camps feel quite resentful towards Westminster. So people in the Leave camp are starting to get concerned that perhaps Article 50 won't be invoked, perhaps Britain will not leave after all. It's plausible to argue that Theresa May could turn around in a year or 2 years and say, we have tried to get access to the single European market, we haven't been able to. The overwhelming advice from British business and industry is that we simply must not leave the European Union. So she could turn to the country and say, because the economy is critical, we cannot leave the EU. Now, a lot of people in the Leave camp are very concerned of that scenario developing. Conversely, a lot of people in the Remain camp believe that having held a referendum was a huge mistake. They believe that it was held for the wrong reasons, for Conservative Party internal reasons, i.e. for David Cameron to keep the party unified going into the general election last year. And also a lot of people in the Remain camp believe that it was too complicated an issue for the ordinary person in Britain to understand, and therefore to trust them with such a huge decision was extremely foolhardy, was extremely foolish. And there is a lot of truth to that. And of course, in the last 3 weeks, the British economy, the British pound, has taken quite a battering. The British pound at the moment is suffering its lowest value in 31 years. So people in the Remain camp are very angry that the government chose to hold a referendum on an issue which is so unbelievably critical to Britain, but at the same time it is so complicated for the average person in Britain to understand, and to have given them the power to decide that potentially could be very dangerous.
And, did Brexit affect the relationship between the Great Britain and the European Union in general? For European Union, it must have been a blow, a really huge blow.
Yeah. Well, I think the European Union made it very clear that they were disappointed by the Brexit victory, though they respected the will of the British electorate. I do believe that a Britain outside of the EU will have economic ramifications, economic consequences for the EU. But let's not forget, the EU is still very large. The EU is still very powerful, and it has the German economy there, the French economy there, the Italian economy there, the Spanish economy. These are real heavyweight economies, and I believe that they can weather the storm and they can get through this. On the other hand, can Britain really weather the storm? Britain constitutes a bridge in the eyes of many foreign investors, for example, Chinese investors, Indian investors. Why do so many Chinese and Indian companies set up base in Britain? Because they can re-export their goods from Britain into the EU, i.e. into a single European market, and they don't have to pay any tariffs, they don't have to pay any duties. So if Britain pulls out of the EU, will Chinese investors and Indian investors still want to keep their investments in Britain? Well, only time will tell. But of course, if they do, they will have to pay hundreds of millions of pounds every year in exporting their goods to Europe, because they will have to pay export duties and tariff duties. Now, in regard to going back to Berlin and Paris, I believe there's a lot of people in the German and French governments who aren't so upset to see Britain leave the EU, if Britain does leave the EU. Why? Because many of them believe that Britain has been a troublemaker in the European Union for at least 2 decades, and there's a lot of truth to that. If you want to become a member of an organisation, you have to accept its rules. You can't simply say, I will join, but I will agree to that rule, but I won't agree to that rule. It doesn't work like that, and Britain has been cherry picking. And that has annoyed a lot of people in Berlin and a lot of people in Paris. But also the Germans and the French regard Britain as America's main eyes and ears in the European Union, because Britain constantly lobbies on behalf of American interests in the European Union. For example, placing sanctions on Russia. For example, increasing NATO's presence in Poland and in the Baltic states. It's Britain that's doing that in the European Union. So I think some French and German politicians won't be so sad to see Britain leave if, of course, Britain does invoke Article 50.
Do you have any other thoughts to share or something to add to make some conclusions on our such discussion?
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone in Russia should be under an illusion that there's an opportunity for a change, an improvement in relations between London and Moscow. That's simply not going to happen. Britain, along with America, is leading this anti-Russian crusade in the world, be it at the United Nations, be it in the European Union, and be it within NATO. Britain has always resented Russia, whether when Russia was Tsarist, when Russia was communist, and post-communist Russia today. Britain has always had a very antagonistic and a very racist, condescending attitude towards Russia and Russians. I'm a journalist at Parliament, at the Houses of Parliament in Westminster, and I hear very disparaging remarks made by British politicians towards Russia, towards the Russian people, regarding them as being low down in life as being barbarians, as being a threat to world civilization, to world democracy. And you have the Defence Secretary and the Foreign Secretary stand up in the House of Commons and say that the Russian military campaign in Syria is not achieving anything against ISIS and the other terrorist groups. It's only killing civilians, and that the military campaign, which is in Syria, which is defeating ISIS, is the American-led campaign. Now that is factually incorrect. That is a blatant lie. But what it shows is that members of the British cabinet have no moral compunction in creating this racist atmosphere towards the Russian people by simply saying all the Russian Air Force in Syria is doing is killing civilians. That just reinforces the impression in Britain, at Westminster, and unfortunately also amongst the British public, that Russia is just a barbaric country and its leaders are murderous and its people have no regard for human rights or value for human beings. It's a very sad state of affairs in Britain, but of course it does have historical precedents, and as I said, historically speaking, Britain has always had a very, very low opinion of Russia.
Thanks for taking the time and agreed to be interviewed. Good luck and bye-bye. I hope we will see you soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.